Welcome to Origins, where we examine the beginnings of the stuff that has impacted our daily lives and contributed to culture. This is your host, Castro, and so, we begin. Most know American writer Edgar Allan Poe as the creator of the modern detective story, and he is often noted as the father of gothic horror fiction, penning such masterpieces as The Raven and the psychological thriller The Telltale Heart. Poe's writing has influenced literature, music, and film, captivating audiences since the 1830s. But before his profound literary contributions, Poe was possibly destined to go down a different path. Today on Origins, we take a look not into Poe's noteworthy literary contributions, but the origins of his military service, from early teen volunteer to Army gunnery sergeant to an appointment at West Point Military Academy, which if he saw it through, American literature and culture might be dramatically different today. As a young child, Poe experienced unthinkable tragedies. His father abandoned him, and his mother died when he was only 2. Shortly after his mother's death, John and Frances Allen adopted him. Most literary historians conclude that Poe had a turbulent relationship with his foster father, John Allen, some of it relating to his motivation, and a lot to do about money. According to the 1973 West Point Military Academy Bulletin Journal, at 15, Poe began his unofficial military service volunteering in a local unit called the Virginia Volunteers. Today, this unit would be equivalent to an ROTC program on a high school or university campus. His unit consisted of young men from well-known families from the Richmond, Virginia area. His role as lieutenant of the Virginia Volunteers was to act as guard of honor when the celebrated General Lafayette of the Revolutionary War, and yes, the musical Hamilton, visited town in late October 1824. It's worth noting that this was not a formal military position for Poe. According to the Raven Society at the University of Virginia, 2 years later, on February 14, 1826, Poe enrolled at the University of Virginia, the 136th of 177 students. The university was recently established in 1819 by Thomas Jefferson, who had a loose connection to the Allen family. Some of the buildings were still under construction, which Poe wrote about in his letters home to his foster father. Despite being a good student, Poe often quarreled with his foster father over the lack of money, so Poe turned to gambling. On all accounts, he was a lousy gambler and accumulated over $2,000 in debt. Adjusted for inflation, that is approximately $50,000 in today's money. As a result, Poe left the University of Virginia on December 15, 1826, and would never return. A few months after leaving the University of Virginia, and now in his birthplace, Boston, Poe's first official military service began. On May 26, 1827, he enlisted in the Army under the name Edgar Allan Poe. His enlistment document can be found on the National Archive website, including the signature Edgar Allan Poe, and his age noted as 22 when he was actually only 18. Some historians theorize that he used the name Perry and age change to conceivably disappear from his gambling debtors and obscure his tracks from his foster father. He was assigned to the 1st Artillery at Fort Independence in Boston Harbor. By July 1827, while serving in the Army, Poe published his first book, Tamerlane and Other Poems, a series of poems, some of which he wrote in his 10 months at the University of Virginia. Although scholars can't agree on the total number of prints, there could have been as little as 20 or as many as 200 printed. Poe paid for the printing out of his own pocket, and the book was published under the pseudonym A Bostonian. It received no acclaim and was effectively disregarded by critics. Tamerlane and Other Poems is one of the rarest books in American literature, with only a handful surviving today, most in museums. At a Christie's auction in 2009, one sold for a whopping $662,500. After serving for roughly 20 months, Poe progressed from private to regimental sergeant major, the highest rank one could achieve as a volunteer. However, Poe unexpectedly requested his release with more than 3 years left on his 5-year service term. To his foster father, he writes, "I have been in the American Army as long as it suits my ends, and it is now time that I should leave. I made known my circumstances to Lieutenant Howard, who promised me my discharge solely upon reconciliation with yourself." Basically, Poe needed his foster father's approval. His request for resignation was approved on April 4, 1829, on the condition imposed by his foster father that he pursues an appointment at West Point Military Academy. It's worth noting that Poe could no longer advance ranks if he stayed in the Army, so West Point was a conceivable platform for him to promote. By May 1829, Poe delivered his credentials, including letters of recommendation and Army service documents, to then Secretary of War John Eaton. 10 months later, he received a West Point appointment. In his first semester at West Point, Poe excelled academically. According to West Point cadet records, he ranked 17th in math and 3rd in French out of dozens of students. Math and French were the only courses Poe was required to take during his first year. Because Poe had served in the Army before West Point, he believed he could move through the academy at an accelerated pace. In a letter to his foster father, Poe writes, "You could have no idea of the immense advantages my present situation in the Army would give me in the appointment of a cadet. I am positive I could run through in 6 months." Nevertheless, Poe realized that he would have to complete the required 4 years without any special treatment, just as the other cadets. Shortly after finding this out, Poe's mindset started to sour because he realized he might not have the time to write. Plus, he was not fond of the regimental duties and routines at West Point. Also around this time, he discovered that his foster father had remarried and removed him from the family inheritance, which appears to be a tipping point for Poe. In a letter to his foster father, Poe writes, "You sent me to West Point like a beggar. I must resign. I have no energy left nor health. For this end, it will be necessary that you endorse me your written permission, for I can leave this place without any permission. From the time of writing this, I shall neglect my studies and duties at the institution, if I do not receive your answer in 10 days. Poe required his foster father's written consent for discharge, but his foster father did not respond to his plea. His foster father did write a letter for his own record that says, "I received this on the 10th and did not from its conclusion deem it necessary to reply to him. I do not think the boy has one good quality. He may do or act as he pleases." And so begins Edgar Allan Poe's self-sabotage from West Point Military Academy. From July to December 1831, Poe was one of the most reoccurring rule breakers at West Point. According to West Point cadet records, he had 44 offenses and 106 demerits for the term. In January 1831, Poe was the Academy's top offender with 66 violations. He failed to attend church services and neglected parades and roll call 13 times, all required by cadets. At the end of January, a general court-martial was issued citing gross neglect of duty and disobedience of orders. The official court-martial documentation states absences from mathematics class on the 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th, 21st, 22nd, 24th, 25th, and 26th of January 1831. This documentation can be viewed online at the National Archive website. Foreseeing his removal, Poe left West Point on February 19, 1831. In a letter to his foster father, Poe writes, "I have been dismissed, when a single line from you would have saved it." You can almost feel the anger in Poe's voice there. The court affirmed his guilt and removed him on March 6, 1831. He was officially no longer affiliated with the military. In late April of 1831, publisher Elam Bliss sent 136 copies of Poems, Poe's third book, to West Point. Before dismissal from West Point, Poe solicited money from fellow cadets, more than half the student body, to help secure funding for printing his book. West Point's financial ledgers show that 135 cadets contributed $1.25, totaling $168.75 to print what some historians believe to be 500 prints of the book Poems. Some of Poe's former classmates were disappointed when the book was delivered, and there is some folklore that exists that cadets collectively launched the book into the Hudson River, though this can't be substantiated. And so ends the story of Edgar Allan Poe's military service. At this period in his life, one can theorize that he was a young man constantly at odds with his foster father. Many historians agree that this was a period in Poe's life when his contributions to literature were insignificant and wildly unsuccessful. Some might even view him as a young man trying to navigate the world and simply trying to find his place. With that, thank you for joining us for this week's Origins podcast on the beginning to the end of Poe's military service. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button to listen to a new Origins episode every Wednesday. Until next week, this is Castro, and I'd like to thank you for listening.